Welcome, everybody, to today's ILTA YouTube video entitled Threading the Needle, Bringing Curiosity and Structure into Difficult Conversations. I am your moderator, Helen Stocklin-Enright, Senior Manager for Development and Operations at Perkins Coie, and I'm thrilled to be joined by two distinguished panelists, Katie Seaver, who is a life and leadership coach, Karen Lisko, Ph.D., who is a senior litigation consultant. Welcome, Katie and Karen. Katie, I'll turn it over to you first to introduce yourself.
Thanks, Helen. So as Helen said, my name is Katie. I am a life and leadership coach. I actually got my start. I was working as a consultant at McKinsey at the beginning of my career. Liked it fine. And in the middle of it, I ended up working with a coach who just completely changed my life. And I was like, I want what she's having. So I became a coach myself after a little bit on that journey. Most of my clients are probably like many of you, most of them are professionals who work often at very large companies. And so we have to have very practical conversations about, if they want to feel better in their lives, if they want to have more energy or more satisfaction, like what are we going to do about it? So I'm excited to share some of those ideas with you guys today.
Thank you, Katie. Karen, over to you to introduce yourself, please.
Well, you will be shocked to hear that when you think about difficult conversations, that plenty of those happen in the law firm environment or in corporate environments. And so part of my learning was to take my doctoral training into the actual conference room, boardroom, and to see how what we know to be useful with difficult conversations can play out when there's also differences in power dynamics, etc. So that is why I love what I do, because I've been doing this for about 30 years. And to be able to actually marry the research with the practical and see some positive results is a pretty cool thing, especially when things can be tense or difficult.
Thank you, Karen.
Huh?
All right. Difficult conversations. When I mention that, you may already be feeling some dread or possibly butterflies in your stomach. We're here today to dive in and unpack how we can bring curiosity and structure into these conversations and help you navigate them. When we refer to difficult conversations today, we are referring to these in the professional context. Perhaps delivering feedback to a member of your team, or letting a partner you work with know that you did not meet the stated objective or came in over budget. Why are we talking about this? Because this can not only be a roadblock to working effectively, but it can impact your happiness and well-being. And being able to more skillfully have these conversations opens up more possibilities for both you and those you work with. So first, we'll explore what it means to look at things through a lens of curiosity and how starting with curiosity opens up more productive possibilities. We'll take a deeper look at what thoughts or body sensations may come up during difficult conversations or even the anticipation of them. And then we'll talk about these conversations with a few difficult and key personality types that may come up for many of you, and talk through what strategies are most beneficial for communicating with each of them. And then we'll wrap up with talking about when breakthroughs can happen. Let's go ahead and dive in. Katie, what does it mean to look at things through a lens of curiosity?
So to me, and I'll start sharing my slides here. To me, I like to make a distinction between, I'm also going to actually share them. I like to make a distinction between judgment and curiosity. I think that sort of makes curiosity more clear. When we're talking about judgment, we're talking about some sort of assessment, which is often veering to the negative about a situation. So I have this model that I often introduce in the beginning of having conversations about difficult conversations with my clients, where there's judgment, which could be about ourselves or about the other person, or curiosity, which tends to be more just neutral. We're noticing our feelings, our needs, our desires, our fears. It's neither good nor bad. It's just neutral. So I wanted to share this model today because I think it's really helpful for thinking through the different options that we have when we have difficult conversations. So I'm going to talk us through it. And then I'm also going to share, I just had a conversation with a client 2 weeks ago about this model and a particular situation she had at work. So I'll share sort of what we talked about and how that was helpful for her. So It's a 2x2, as so many good models are. We have judgment versus curiosity, and we have self versus other. So starting in the upper left with this one that I've called 1, we can have judgment about ourselves. So if we go to a difficult conversation and that difficult conversation brings something up for us, we can have judgment about our own actions. We can say like, oh my gosh, I can't believe I made this mistake. We can have judgment about our identity. Like, I'm not good at this job. And I just want to flag that one but whenever we go from like judging the action ourselves to judging our identity, that's when things are going to get really, really dicey. Like, we're going to get really upset, really fixated on something because it's like hit something core within us. It's not only we made a mistake, it's like we are bad. We can also do that to the other person, of course. We can say like, oh my gosh, I can't believe they did that. We can also say something about them, like, oh, they're just kind of a pushy person. That's like who they are. And it's not that that's inherently bad, but it is that it will often, as you said, Helen, like lead to it being a less productive conversation. So I'm going to flip it over to curiosity, and then we'll talk about how that applies. So the curiosity side of it is we can have curiosity about ourselves. We can be like, instead of like, oh, I can't believe I made that mistake, we can say, you know, I was really struggling with this particular piece of it. Or we can have curiosity about these different pieces that I put here. Like, yeah, I just really wanted clarity at the time. I really wanted to know how to spend my time, or I felt so frustrated, or I felt so confused. Or we can have curiosity about our own feelings. Like, I was really afraid of negative feedback in this scenario. We would also have curiosity about the other person. Like, oh man, it seems like they just like really wanted me to see their side of things, or they felt really stressed. Or they were really afraid that someone would give them bad feedback. So the sort of curiosity side of things. And the key here, of course, is not that we should do this just because it's valuable in and of itself, but because if we have that curiosity, we tend to approach the conversation in a much more productive way. If we're feeling attacked ourselves, like I'm not good at this job, we're more likely to lash out. We're less likely to be open to actual productive problem solving. If we're feeling like frustrated and judgy toward them, like they're just a pushy person, we're also less likely to come to the negotiating table open to productive conversation. So I wanted to give one recent client example of this. I had a client who works in a large government contractor in the technology space, and she's pretty high up in the management structure. And this organization just recently did a big reorg. So everybody's in a different spot than they were before. A bunch of people got let go. And then she was leading a lot of kind of how that was going to go down. And then there came the day when they actually pulled the trigger. And all the people who were going to leave and had hopefully done all this knowledge transfer left, and all this new stuff came in. And she had someone on that first day send her a message on Slack saying, oh, I would have expected that you would have given us more clarity about how the new Slack groups were going to go and how the new huddles were going to go. I guess they have these regular meetings. And she was fixated on this comment all day. And I love this example because it also shows how difficult conversations can happen in that they can be asynchronous, they can be in multiple pieces. It's not always like, we're going to get in a room and have the difficult conversation, though of course that does happen sometimes. But sometimes it's like, oh, this person said something, I'm fixated on it, I'm going to have to go back and talk to them again about this. Maybe there's going to be a third conversation after this. It can be in multiple pieces. So we had to have this conversation about, okay, how is she going to proceed? And when I got to her, she was very much in 1 and 2, right? She was judging herself. She was having these thoughts like, I didn't communicate enough. I should have had these things more figured out. This week wasn't as organized as it should have been. I should have anticipated every need. And then we really dug into it. There's like identity stuff, which of course was why she was kind of fixated on it. Like, I'm not leading very well. Maybe I'm not a good leader. She's sort of newer to this role. But then she was like, but Katie, I'm really working on it. So like, I'm trying to feel better. And really, she was getting herself to number 2. She was like, you know what? It's also not a big deal. Like, they can just put it anywhere on Slack. People are a little too fixated on how the Slack groups are going to go. Just stick it somewhere on Slack and tag someone and you'll get your question answered. And then she was getting to like, you know, they're like a little needy. You know, and I like this example because she also wasn't like so mean and so angry, but obviously she was judging this person like, you know, they're not really a self-starter. And she felt like that was progress. And like, in some ways it was because she wasn't feeling as terrible as when she was attacking herself. Like, it does feel better to attack the other person than to at least attack yourself typically. But also neither of those were super productive, right? She wasn't gonna feel amazing if she wasn't going to come back to that conversation in as productive of a way if she's just feeling about this person like, well, they're kind of needy and they're not a self-starter. So then we had the conversation about, okay, how can we bring it to 3 and 4? Like, what is productive about those ones? So we talked about her desires, like, oh man, I was just really wanting to be perceived as a competent leader. It's so hard to get criticism when you have spent weeks and freaking months planning this reorg, and then finally the trigger gets pulled. So like some compassion for herself to kind of get herself less agitated, to come down, to feel more compassionate towards herself. And then some curiosity about them, like, wow, she was really frustrated. Like she was really angry with me about this whole situation. So what was going on for her? You know, maybe she doesn't know when her job is going to feel calm and routine again. Maybe all these people actually finally leaving made her feel stressed out about how this was going to go. And again, the key here is that curiosity isn't the final step, but if you come to it from that place, you're softer, you're calmer, you're more open to negotiation. And then we can actually say, okay, what do you believe? And for her, she actually didn't feel that she'd made a mistake. She wanted people to figure out their Slack groups on their own over the next week or two. And then she was gonna give more guidance. But once that happened, and she could soften herself, be more open to what they were saying, be more open to what she actually felt, then she could say, okay, maybe I do want to communicate that to her. Like, this is how it's going to happen. We aren't going to let you know about new Slack assignments right now. This sounds so silly, but isn't this what we all get fixated on? These dumb things that then we're just like totally upset about all day. The Slack groups. This is so like how organizations work. So that she could decide what she was going to do. And you're going to find this in all of my examples. Like, it's not that we're just going to be stuck in these hippy dippy flowy feelings. It's that when we're actually curious about it, then we can decide what the practical implication is, but then we can come to the other person in a much more productive way. And perhaps what we say is still what's going to go, but we can do that in a more useful, productive way from this lens of curiosity.
Katie, this is excellent and very interesting. I am wondering if somebody finds themselves stuck. Let's say they're in one, they're judged about themselves, they've watched this, they think maybe their identity is triggered. Where do they go from there?
Ooh, okay, love it. Okay, so I think the two places to start. One would be to just try to move yourself to curiosity, because it's hard to even have compassion or curiosity to the other person when you're feeling completely triggered. So I like to start by just saying really gentle, kind things to myself, like, this is really hard for you. And then you're like, typically we'll often kind of soften. We'll be like, oh my gosh, it is. I was wanting this to go well, or it's so hard. I was trying so hard to make this project come in on time, and despite my best efforts, it didn't. And whenever you can like soften into it a little bit, just like giving yourself compassion the same way a friend would, or a coach, or even a therapist, just to be like, oh my gosh, you really struggled with this. It was so hard to get that feedback. It's like, it was so hard to get that feedback. And you can just do that to yourself a little bit internally, and that tends to be useful. And if you're a little softened to yourself, usually you can be like, what do you think they were feeling right now? And it's like, well, I guess they might have just been feeling overwhelmed. And then some questions about like what they might have been feeling, or what do you think they were afraid of, or what do you think they were hoping for, versus some sort of judgments about like, oh, they're just kind of lazy. They're not really together. They're not on top of things, versus like, they really struggle to get organized. That tends to be a little more productive.
So, Katie, I'm curious about something, because I love when you are in that space and you think about, I know this is how I can get, I know I can fixate. So we tend to know ourselves pretty well. I'm a fan of, for lack of a better word, mantras or slogans. Like, if I am thinking about this, and I certainly can live in 1 and 2, to think of the person as data. And that's what I say to myself. And that's what I talk to clients about too, to say, treat what they're telling you as data, because then it pulls the emotion out of it and truly then allows you to get a bit more objective.
Yeah.
But what do you think about that?
I think that's beautiful. Whenever you can like not be emotionally triggered by something,
Yeah.
and be, able to analyze it. I love that. I will also say, sometimes when our emotional systems, we could call it the limbic system, or we could just say like our emotions are totally triggered when we're agitated in our bodies, it can be really hard to be as objective. And I know we're going to talk about this in a second. So often I'm also giving clients strategies to like calm their nervous systems, to get them somatically in a calmer space, and then they can do some more work like this. And that doesn't have to be so fancy sounding. Sometimes it's just like taking a walk, or like putting down the laptop, getting somewhere where we can be calm. Often in office spaces, it's like, can you step outside the building? Or like, if we're literally in an office space, can we find an empty conference room? Can we even go sit in the bathroom quietly just to like get ourselves to be a little calmer? Because if we're like totally agitated, we're just not, our brains are going to be fixated. I think it's really hard to get out of that space. But I love your point. I mean, to the extent that we can annotate, that's so great.
Excellent. Well, let's go into thoughts and somatic sensations. So, Katie, do you want to talk a little bit more about some of these that can come up in difficult conversations?
Yeah. So when we talk about somatic sensations, just to define the terms, I feel like that's sometimes a more coachy term. That just means anything relating to the body. So we can talk about body-based reactions. The truth is that all of us are having body-based reactions to everything in our lives if we're paying attention. But when we're having a difficult conversation, the volume gets turned up to 10. It's so loud. So we'll often, the fight or flight is like the sort of more obvious one. Like you might just be like, heart racing, or you might get kind of sweaty, or you might be feeling a lot of like jumpiness or jitteriness in your body. I often introduce the idea of agitation more generally to my clients, like just like my water bottle can be agitated, I can shake it, like we can be shaken up. Sometimes I feel like, especially with my clients, or maybe it's all of us, like we don't like to say like I'm in fight or flight mode. That doesn't, it feels like, well, that's not me, right? If you just got a Slack message about Slack messages, like my client did, we don't want to think to ourselves, oh, I'm in fight or flight, but we can say to ourselves like, oh, I'm slightly agitated. Like that seems to be easier to admit to ourselves that we got a little bit agitated. So I often do that. We're like a little shaken up, and we will notice the different ways in which our bodies get kind of shaken up. Like we feel jumpy. We feel like we can't sit still. We feel like we can't focus. Of course, I also wrote down here, there's like a desire to cry. Sometimes like people, I will have clients who like in certain kinds of conversations, especially around feedback or negotiation, will get so triggered that like the desire for tears can come as well. But then I also put here, like many of my clients have these very cognitive jobs. So they may be not really spending a lot of their days in their body, and they may not even notice, but the tell to them might be suddenly like the brain doesn't work. Like the brain is spinning, the brain is fixated. And we may have, in fact, maybe if you were even slightly in your body, then you've completely jumped up to your head. So again, if you could do anything to kind of like get in the body, or even just notice, oh my gosh, I'm sweating and my heart is racing, that typically even of itself will calm your nervous system, just to like be noticing it. But those are kind of the tells. I think we've probably all noticed times when we're so agitated from a really challenging conversation and we're all jumpy.
So when you're in that moment of agitation and maybe you're not sensing your body, how do you get into your body? How do you help people do that?
Oh, that is such a great question. Well, so there's two situations, right? There's like if you're actually in a conversation with another person live versus if you have some time and space to think on your own, if this is happening over Slack or asynchronously or whatever. If you're on your own, then typically what I would say is lower the stimulation, close the laptop, walk away from the desk, make sure you're not doing anything that will keep you in your head. And then try to sense into your body. So that might just literally be like, okay, how does my body feel right now? How does my chest feel right now? For many of my clients, if they're super agitated, there's I mean, this is not just my clients, this is me too. There's an unwillingness to be in your body, because we know on some level, if we enter our body, it's going to feel terrible. We're going to feel just like jumpy and bad. So sometimes doing something to like lower the agitation level, like taking a walk or something like that, even just puttering around the house if they're working from home, can kind of lower it enough that then they're willing to be in their bodies. Because sometimes it just feels terrible. If you've had this like agitating, difficult conversation, the last thing you want to do is feel how terrible you feel. So like there can be an in-between period, and then we can enter the bodies. If you're literally in the difficult conversation itself and you can't escape it and your whole body is agitated. I had this experience early on in my career. I was like getting it wasn't even terrible feedback, but it like triggered my identity feedback when I was a McKinsey consultant, and I like noticed like I wanted to cry because it was just like, it was what I didn't want to hear. And in those situations, even just being like, wow, my body is very agitated right now. Just saying that to yourself, like, oh man, like the desire to cry is strong within me. Like as this is happening, like naming it and having some awareness, I also feel like can really calm us down. That actually helped me a lot in that moment. Not that it was perfect, because it was still a hard conversation for me, but just having that internal narrative that it's happening can be really helpful. Yeah.
Katie, can I throw in a short anecdote for
Please.
something to supplement? This is all so good. The other thing, especially when you are in that conversation and you cannot take the walk, like you said, you've got to be feeling it and dealing with it right in front of the person. It comes through really poignant an example just from last week. Part of what I do in my work is I help prepare witnesses to testify. And so this witness in particular was a physician who had been sued. So already high stress. And now he's thrown into a deposition, which is completely foreign. So now he's got the external stress of the setting, being questioned about his judgment by someone, plaintiff's lawyer, who is not also a physician, but is acting like one. So a lot of those triggers are all there, and his very being is being questioned. So I said to him, you know, research finds if you can take 3 deep breaths while you're listening to a question or while they're going on the record, research finds that if you can get more oxygen to your brain works better. You know, it makes sense, but we all can often go to shallow breathing when we're under stress. So the funny part was dear man in his 80s says to me, do I do it like this? I said, okay, we're going to figure out how to do this silently. So it truly is useful to think about, how do you do it like I just did? No noise. And do it in a way that it's giving now your body a job, and it's hopefully getting more oxygen and clear thinking to your brain. So that was the work last week, but I have seen it work quite well with clients where they could also add that job description of deep silent breaths while you're stressed out.
I love that, Karen. The nose breathing versus like some serious mouth breathing. But yeah, I think, and also like having a defined practice like that, like, okay, my job is to take 3 deep breaths at various times to calm myself down. The breathing can be so useful. And also the neuroscience that I read on it is that we can't be simultaneously in the analysis, in the sort of analysis portion of our brain and in the direct experiencing portion of our brain. So a practice like that is going to bring us into direct experience. There are other kinds of practices like just noticing how your feet feel or like noticing how your hands feel that tend to bring us out of like the spinning type of space. And anything like that can be so useful, just like any direct experiencing of it. Like, how do you feel in the chair? You know, that kind of stuff. Yeah, I love that.
This is fantastic and very practical to everyday work and these conversations as well. So as we talk, we've covered some fantastic ground already. And as we talk about bringing in an awareness of our bodies, bringing in shifting to a place of curiosity, Katie, I'm curious if you have any further suggestions or specific examples on how you prepare for these conversations or bring that mindset in.
Yeah, definitely. So I wanted to talk about a couple of things that I do when I'm with clients who can prep for those difficult conversations. They know it's coming. And I'll give another specific client example here. So the one very helpful frame that I will give clients just up top is that we want to transition from like an adversarial conversation to a learning conversation. Like we're just trying to figure out, often I'll say like, what happened? And this is an important shift because often we assume that we know what happened. We were both there. I saw what happened. This is, we are very objective about it, probably, especially if you're in, a field where you feel that you're capable of observing things accurately. But the truth is that actually we don't know what happened. Even if everything that happened occurred while we were both in the room together, we will have observed different things because we were sitting in different places. And certainly we will be filtering whatever we observe through all of our past history, our experience, our feelings. And then typically there will be things that happen while we weren't exactly in the room together. So these three things that I share here are sort of different lenses through which to have that kind of what happened in conversation. But even if I can send a client into a conversation, just being like, okay, your job is to have both of you share what happened, we've already going to have a more productive conversation. But here's a couple of lenses through that. So the first is this like sort of what happened conversation, this assumption that one person's story is right, the other person's story is wrong. It's going to be either or. We can also have it through a lens of like, I wonder what happened through their lens, because like I don't actually know fully what happened from their side of things. And also, I wonder if you really know what I think happened, because maybe they don't. I shouldn't assume. There's also this distinction that I will have clients make between impact and intention. And this one is just like so powerful. We can say that they meant to have this impact on me, and also I know what impact I had on them, but usually this is also false. All we know is our intention, and all we also know is their impact on us. We don't know the flip side of both of those things. So we would all want to have the conversation to say, here's the impact that you had on me, but I don't know what your intention was. And conversely, I know what I was intending to do, but what impact did it have on you? That can be a very useful kind of what happened conversation. And then the final one is this fault versus contribution. Like, okay, this is their fault. They did the wrong thing. Versus there's contribution from everyone. And this is so useful. This is also very useful in private life as well, even though we're in a public conversation. But even just naming your own contribution to any problem tends to make the other person soften a lot. Even if your own contribution was only 1%, even if your own contribution was only 0.1%, you have contributed. And that might only be by not bringing up this issue till now. You contributed to this problem occurring in that way. So I'll give a client example. I have a client who is in the C-suite at a well-known entertainment company, very high-ranking person. She had a direct report that she was very frustrated with, who managed a very large sort of region of the world. And she felt like she'd given this person feedback. She told them what they needed to do. They had gone and done not that, and it had gone poorly. And she felt like this person is just not listening to me. I'm probably gonna have to let them go when she came to this conversation. So she was like, but she was gonna sort of try to get the feedback, but she was like, probably they gotta go. And I was like, okay, can we go through each of these things? Because she has this, first of all, in terms of what happened, she has a perspective on what happened. She told them this stuff. This person went and did something different. It didn't go well. She knew it wouldn't go well. Like, this person is just terrible, but she doesn't know anything actually about what happened from their end. Maybe they heard something differently from her. Maybe they were taking in all kinds of other information that led them to act that way. So first of all, can she just have a what happened conversation of curiosity? Also, can she have an impact versus intention conversation? Even just using the words impact versus intention can be so useful here. Like, I wonder what your intention was, because the impact that it had on me was I felt like, wow, this person's really not listening to me, and I'm worried that I can't trust them, right? Maybe this person's intention was, I want to prove that I'm a self-starter, or, of course I want to take care of my boss. And then also a contribution conversation where she could say, you know what? I think I also contributed to this because I should have brought this up with you as soon as it happened. And now it's gone on longer. Things have gotten messier. Again, people just like really softening when you have that kind of contribution. So those are, if we can just remember, first of all, what happened conversation, but a couple of these key ones, even if you can just come in and distinguish between impact and intention, that tends to be very powerful. If you can talk about contribution, that tends to be very powerful. And then I had a final example here as we're talking about strategies, which is that sometimes it can also be really useful to come to it from a perspective of like not needing the other person to change at all. I had a client a little while ago who works for a large energy company, and she was entering a new role, and the person who was training her was just really not very helpful. And she was coming in to replace her, and the person was just like, sort of like too busy to help her a lot, kind of short and abrupt when she was answering her questions. My client is the most warm, lovely person. She was using every tool in her toolbox to try to befriend this person, get on her team, make her like her, all the things. And she was fundamentally having this thought, which was, they don't like me. This is bad. I need to fix it. It was stressing her out. She was spending all this time worrying about it. And ultimately, we came to this thought, which I think all of us should steal because it's so useful, which is just like, you know what? Maybe just 5% of people aren't going to like me no matter what I do. And maybe I've just found one of them. And it's this person. you know, and if I fix myself so that these 5% of people like me, we'd find another 5% that don't like me. And she was a very quantitatively oriented person, so the percentages really worked for her. My brain likes percentages too. And she would just sit with this person. She'd be like, oh, you are my 5%. Hello. And you can imagine, even as you say that you just relax. And don't you become more likable than when you're like, hello, will you please like me? I'm being friendly, you know? And the relationship became easier. Not that it was ever perfect. Because yeah, probably this person and it might not even have been about her, right? There was some political stuff going on in the organization that she then was walking into. You know, it wasn't even totally at all her fault, really. But just the relaxation of saying, you don't have to change. You don't even have to like me. You don't even have to think I'm doing a good job, right? We could change this to 5% of people will think I'm doing a terrible job, no matter what I do. So I just found you and I can just look at you and be like, hello, you think I'm doing a terrible job? How are you? And then the conversation tends to be more productive. So I think this is also a good one for all of us, just like keep in our back pockets when we find ourselves in situations like that.
Thanks, Katie. Karen, I'm curious, do you see this show up in your work?
All the time. I am taking this all in. This is such rich information. Katie, you're so good. I mean, it really is so useful to be thinking about how do you take this and use it in the moment. And I think that's the beauty of what you've just gone through. This is so user friendly. It's not just something ethereal out there. That's great.
Thank you, Karen.
Thank you. Okay. All right. Let's go ahead and delve into some difficult personality types. And Karen, I'm curious to hear from you. What are some of the key difficult personality types that people may encounter? And how do we navigate communicating with them?
Well, first of all, the difficult personality types, the biggest thing to think about is they're not always difficult. In other words, they could be lovely human beings in a lot of different settings, and others might encounter them in a way that is not difficult at all. We're all triggered by different interactions based on who we are too. But the research identifies 7. I'm not going to go into all 7. I'm going to go into the top 3 because every time I survey an audience in advance to find out who are your most difficult personality or interactions, odds are that same top 3 keep surfacing. So I'm going to go into those. But those top 3 have something in common, and that is that, again, can be lovely in most interactions, but when they hit what's called the zone of stress, then things get more intense. And so they can show up in a more extreme way, which allows us to become a victim to that, to think about, well, I'm not being difficult and I'm stressed out. What's wrong with them? So part of it is knowing, just like you said, Katie, how are you taking it in and how can you get curious? And then how can you identify, hold on, this is the steamroller. There are techniques I can use. So that's what I'm going to go through with you here. Specifically, so now I will, in a second, share my screen. Let's talk about the most difficult personality for most people. The person is called the steamroller. They can sometimes also be called the bulldozer, someone who, when they need to get things done and are in stress, get much more curt, much more tense, can get volume, can go way up, can get louder, can physically shorten the distance between you and that person because they want it done. They want it done now, and they want it done their way. And so this is what can often feel like physical threat. You know, I was thinking, Katie, about what you said about the limbic system and how this really can get us into fight or flight. But what we know is that most people, when they encounter a steamroller, want to flee. They are not necessarily prone to say, I want to keep this going and to fight. But part of it comes to understanding what makes each of these personalities tick. And I'm going to tell you 5 things that can often be what makes the steamroller tick, because it again gets to treating the person like data, being curious, as Katie, you were just saying, And to understand that this is not just about you. This is not just, is this person a jerk? There's more to all of us than that. So first of all, one of the biggest motivators for the steamroller is he or she must prove to themselves on an ongoing basis that their view of the world is correct. So this is a very black and white view of the world, very binary. There's very little gray in a steamroller's sphere, at least when they're under stress. Secondly, they see tasks as clear and concrete. I need you, when I'm steamrolling, to get it done. It's a simple task, just do it. Okay, so that's often even how the dialogue can go. Third, being a steamroller works for the person. They have tried it on for size, maybe many times when they are tense, deadline driven, etc., and it gets the job done. So this is a person who knows they've experimented with this mode of their persona, and it does achieve what they want in the short term, at least. Part of the fourth then is that this person is often a very low self-monitor. You know, people can either be high self-monitors where they're really in tune with how their interactions go and how they might impact others around them. A steamroller personality tends to be the opposite, tends to be a little more myopic in their world, sees what they need to get done, and may not even be that interested in understanding or appreciating the impact it has to other people. And then let me just tell you, the fifth is my favorite, because when I was early in my career, I got my PhD pretty young. I got it when I was 25. 2 weeks after I finished my doctorate, I was working at a consulting firm full time with very senior litigators. And I was scared to death. And I encountered some of them who were the steamroller. And I did the flight. I did what a lot of my clients still to this day tell me they do. I backed down. Because think about it. A steamroller is in your path, bulldozing you down. Your survival instinct is to get out of the way and just finish the interaction as quickly as you can. Here's why the fifth became so meaningful to me, and frankly, why I started reading and studying difficult personalities, because I needed to get better at it. The fifth thing about the steamroller, about what makes that person tick, is that they value assertive people and they devalue non-assertive people. So think about that. This is not intuitive. A steamroller wants what they want. They're a low self-monitor. It works for them. Yet I'm telling you that you want to assert back instead of backing down. And the thing that I suggest to people who are reluctant to believe what I say on this is, if you know anything about the steamroller and their sphere personally, think about who their friends are, maybe their spouse, and and what seems to be a happy marriage from what you can tell, or partnership. You will find that a lot of their friends, partner, are the ones who say, cut it out. Come on. Come on, you got to be thinking about this in another way. Okay, so this is a personal example. I'm not suggesting this is how you will talk to the steamroller, but my point is, you will often see, if you can get a level deeper in understanding the steamroller, that the people they value and encircle themselves with are the people who take them to task, hold them accountable. They're non-assertive, get out of the way kinds of folks are not typically their closest friends. All right, so then what backfires? What backfires is if you counterattack in anger. I'm suggesting, of course, that you be assertive, but you have to think about how you're doing it. Or, like I said, you back down. So if you do either of those also can be just like what I call train wreck methods that backfire. So now I'm going to share my screen here to get to some steps. And I want to start by saying that part of it is knowing what your goal is. Too often we have a consistent goal, which can often be too high an expectation of how the interaction will go. And that can lead to failure as well. You want to make your expectations realistic. In fact, when I also do a lot of reading and talking about the science of happiness. And the bottom line in the science of happiness is if you want to be happier, lower your expectations of the other person. Then you will be able to get to a point where you're not holding them to an impossible standard. Okay, so similarly here, your goal with the steamroller is simply to command respect, not to change the person, not to get a pat on the back that you've just changed their world. If you have those expectations, they're not as likely to be fulfilled. So let's take an example. Let's assume that this also has to do with power structure, because that's often endemic to the steamroller interaction, where you might be more junior to that person. So assume you're at a more junior level to the person you're speaking with. You might be a junior professional and the steamroller is a partner at a law firm. So that person also comes with mileage, that person comes with seniority, and that can add on intensity to the steamroller. And let's assume that the steamroller is very clear about what she wants you to do. And you know that she's not exactly right, but she wants it done a certain way. Maybe it has something to do with using a different technology solution than what you ordinarily would want to have be the approach. So steamroller is usually someone, especially if they're stressed out, deadline driven, who comes in with a monologue. The biggest key is to think about what you're doing non-verbally, because oftentimes the mistake we all make with the steamroller is we break eye contact. We might actually get smaller, like we shrink into our body some. And some of that is problematic because while it's understandable, again, your body is saying, get out of the way. So you're literally removing yourself non-verbally, that's already signaling to a steamroller, if they're alert to what you're doing non-verbally, that they've already got you at a point of backing down or shifting or fleeing. So the key is to keep strong, steady eye contact and to think about what your face is doing if you're on a Zoom. Are you like this, moving away, shifting around, or are you looking curious? Are you looking through your facial expression like, I am here, I'm alert, I'm taking this in? As opposed to, again, remember, you don't want to counterattack in anger, because too often the problem we have when we encounter a difficult personality is our brain is already moving ahead and we are not listening effectively. So this is where the work is. The work is, how do you stay present when you encounter any difficult personality, instead of going to, like what Katie said, which is when you're focusing on, they hurt me, I'm the victim here. This is not going to make you a good listener. So stand your ground both visually and mentally. Keep the eye contact, keep it steady. Some of this too is, if you've got somebody who's fired up, give that person time to run down. Give that person time to say it. Too often we want to interrupt it because we want to get through it faster. That usually backfires with the steamroller. But at a certain point, you may need to interrupt the attack. So give that person adequate time to be in that conversation, even though it's a monologue. And then at a certain point, and again, if you're on Zoom, you can be doing it with a nonverbal. You can lean in, which is, by the way, one thing we know to be useful is to lean in and smile, but to be firm in how you use your voice. So when you interrupt the attack, this is the key, to make sure you're not doing a yes, but, or I don't agree with that, but still to think about the fact that with a steamroller, you often need to be word efficient. You're not going to get the volume of words in a typical interaction you might have with someone else who is not being difficult. So you need to be thoughtful about how you interrupt. And this is actually something I teach called the curiosity filter. So it's so funny, Katie, when I heard, you and I have talked about curiosity, I use curiosity filter for the first line in what you say to someone in a meeting, in a speech, in any kind of setting where you know you want to get the floor. So the curiosity filter is something that jolts in a way, but not in a cruel way. So this person, remember, is someone who's a partner who thinks she knows the Holy Grail on the technology. She understands what you're saying, but she doesn't like your solution. So if you interrupt, say it in a way that is germane to the topic. It could be something as simple as saying, I love what you're saying about technology, and I suggest we go 20% different. Okay, now 20% different. What does that mean? That's the point. The point is to make it a bit cryptic or to make the steamroller curious, because she's used to people often placating. So it's useful if there is something you love about what she's saying. You have to be authentic. Don't say it if you don't mean it. But if you start with that, now this is what I call being a window and not a door. Being a door is saying, I can't do that, or I'm not doing that, or fine, I'll do that. That's actually, that last example is still being a door, because you have literally shut down. You have shut the door on dialogue. But when you're a window, you've gone from, I love a lot of what you're saying, and I want to suggest 20% different. Now the window is, let's talk about that 20%. And then bottom line your point. Be very clear and word efficient in how you describe that 20% difference. And then if possible, leave that creating peace with honor. Here's another way that I think about this last step. This last step is literally about you thinking, not that I'm the victim, but that I'm the host of this conversation with, understandably, a fairly extreme persona in someone who is stressed out as the steamroller. So it's figuring out, is there a way that you can leave the room, leave the Zoom, something that allows you to be the grown-up in the room, because that's who you are and who you want to be, but to do it in a way that says authentically, I'm glad we could talk about it, and it looks like our 20% is closer to 14%. I can live with that. I'm getting to work for you. Okay, a little bit of humor, something that says, I'm taking action. Let's go. So that is a structural approach to dealing with the steamroller. I do want to say, obviously, 6 steps is a lot, and you want to think about, is this the only way to do it? No, this is one way to do it that can be really effective, and you'll vary it. But another problem with structure, as I suggest and endorse it, is it can feel clunky. It can feel like so much structure that you're thinking, how on earth do I take this out in a regular conversation and have it at the ready? So some of this is pre-thinking, knowing perhaps who this person is, knowing that you're about to, on a Tuesday afternoon, be in a conversation with this person. It's the beauty of Zoom, by the way. If you are on in this kind of a setting, you can have these steps available and try them out, but expect it to be a little bit clunky when you try it for the first time. Anytime we try to structure a conversation that we organically normally have, it's going to feel a little awkward to us. But even if you accomplish some of this, you're going to feel progress, and that's the point of it. And then you're going to tailor it yourself. So
Karen,
Helen, that's the steamroller.
Karen, I have one quick question. This is very interesting.
Yeah.
What could somebody do if they find themselves in a conversation with an unknown steamroller? They step in to meet somebody new. They've not worked with this person before. They find themselves in the middle of this process and the attack is coming and they haven't done the steps and they haven't prepared. What can they do?
Well, I would go back to Katie's model, first of all, in terms of thinking about, I know my job is to be curious. I mean, that's the thing that's so user-friendly, is there's so much more to what, Katie, you were talking about, but I think it's also getting to the point where you can just remove yourself and say, I'm identifying this person is extreme and difficult for me. I need to do what I need to do to make this less about me and more about what is it that this person needs. But Katie, you probably have deeper thoughts than I do on that.
Honestly, what came up for me when you asked it, Helen, was your 5th point, which I wrote down and I circled for myself, which was just like they value assertive people,
Right.
right? The inclination is to be like, I'm being attacked or I'm bad or whatever it is. But like, oh yeah, what they need from me right now is actually like a really strong wall that we can push against, is just like, I think just a beautiful mental shift. Like, I feel like even if you forget I actually loved your framework too, but even if you forget that, you're just like,
Right.
oh, they need a strong wall. You know, I'm going to be that for them. I'm just going to
Right.
stand up and make eye contact. All your points, like if you just remember that, I think like can flow so well. Yeah, I'm going to make the eye contact. I'm going to come in really concisely because I am just like strong and steady and like I can push right back. You're welcome. You know, I know you want that.
Exactly. And I think part of it too is trying to give yourself a pretty quick pep talk about the fact that you're in the room, whether it's physically or remotely, and you deserve to be. You're not there because you've been called into the principal's office. You're there because you were hired to do a job. You are the right person in that interaction at that moment in time, not someone who's being called out on the carpet. And so think about that and think about, how do I pull my training, even if you're junior? That's the other part of this that can be challenging. Too often when we are junior, we think, oh, they know so much more than I do. They must be right. Well, not necessarily. Not necessarily. You were hired for that job because you have something to contribute. So if you can get yourself in that understandably task-oriented mode in what can be a very emotional moment, now again, you're getting yourself pulled away from the drama, because this person's all about drama. In fact, all these difficult personalities are all about drama, to be sure.
Yeah, I love that, Karen. I was also going to say sometimes I need this myself too, but Karen's point about what you're doing in your body and the nonverbal cues is so powerful. And for many of us, our body shape allows us to show up differently on an emotional or psychological level. So even just being like, my heart might be racing secretly, and I know I should be assertive, but I don't feel it. But like, I am going to stand up straight and I am going to like make sure that I'm making eye contact. That, like, we feel differently when our shoulders are back and we say different words than if we're like, okay, I'm going to push back.
Exactly.
Yeah, just like, but you can control that even if you can't control the racing heart, and like that will help.
Exactly. Yep. Very well said.
There's so much here. Do we want to dive into another personality type, Karen?
Sure. Are you
Okay.
ready for the know-it-all?
Yes.
All right. Let's talk about the know-it-all. And let me see about, I did a few clicks here that I need to fix on sharing my screen. Let me just go to this mode, and then I'll ask you if you can see it when I go into presentation mode here. Okay. Do you see that for presentation mode?
Yes.
Okay, I'm going to hit the B key. That's the secret to making your screen go black. So I'm going to do that for a second so we can just talk to each other about this personality. The know-it-all is someone we've all encountered. Oftentimes I joke, it's the person you're sitting next to at Thanksgiving dinner. You know, you can't get away from the person. They know everything. It's always ironic when the person is someone who knows more about your job or your training than you do, isn't it? Haven't we all had that experience? You know, I will tell you, some people call me a jury consultant, and that is something that's known more commonly. So the minute I say that, people will be like, I know what it's like to be with juries. So they tell you their stories. But the thing to think about with the know-it-all is, this person is hungry to connect. So their intent is good. Their intent is not to first and foremost show you how smart they are, but it's more to connect with you by showing you how smart they are. So that's part of it. But let's talk about, there are 5 things for this person, all things to understand about what makes the know-it-all tick. The know-it-all does want admiration. So there's a little bit of that need and hunger in that person. But the interesting thing, second thing about this person is they're curious about the world. They really are curious. They want to know more about how the world works And therefore, they may do a fair amount of reading. They don't always just make things up. But the third thing is what makes this difficult. Other people's ideas for a know-it-all are often irrelevant. So you may have something to contribute to the conversation, especially when you're in the professional setting. But part of it is, again, keeping your expectations low. Don't assume that you are going to be a source of knowledge for the know-it-all, which is ironic, I get. All right. Fourth, this person is pretty good at creating reality from partial information. A know-it-all is a pretty much a, you think about Cliff's Notes, or you think about any kind of Wikipedia, anything that gives you a snappy kind of piece of information, not always accurate, or they start to read on something and then they fill in the gaps and think, I don't need to keep reading. I now know it all. So they can create reality from partial information, which, as we all know, means they might be wrong because these other information they didn't get has gone by the wayside. But the challenge with this person, distinct from the steamroller, is a direct challenge from you to them is seen as a personal attack. So that's why this is definitely not a one-size-fits-all in terms of different personalities. So what can actually backfire? We often feel the compunction to show them up. It's understandable, doesn't usually work. You become a competitive know-it-all, doesn't usually succeed. Second is often the heavy sigh in your brain of you're just fuming about it silently, and you're hoping other people see what you see, which is that the know-it-all knows it's some, but not all. Here's the challenge, especially if you're in a technical discussion with non-technical folks, the know-it-all can be impressive first blush. Know-it-all can be impressive first impression. So sometimes someone who's in that setting with you, who is less knowledgeable than you in the know-it-all, thinks the know-it-all is on target. So the other final thing is that you might lose it and become a steamroller yourself, which is not useful. So let's look at, we've talked about, we're going back to this. There you go, refresh on the steamroller. Let's go to your goal with the know-it-all. Again, realistic goals. Getting the know-it-all to consider alternative views. That's progress. So it's not failure just because you haven't shown up the know-it-all or gotten the know-it-all to completely change their worldview. Neither of those are realistic goals with someone who's in this mindset. So let's assume this is a colleague of yours. Let's assume you're working with this person on your knowledge management team, and they show up a lot in meetings, conversations, speaking as if they really are the authority on something. And much, again, of what they say is accurate. So it's not like you're disagreeing completely with them, but it's also important to try to get some level playing field here. So first truly is to do what's hard to do. And that is to listen and to authentically acknowledge their expertise. Do not become flowery with this person. Do not gush with this person, but don't be stingy with this person. Be genuine. If you feel like they just pontificated on 3 points and point number 2 was on the spot, then get specific and acknowledge the specific expertise. That second point you just made, I'd never thought of that before. I really appreciate that. But let's say there's something about point 3 that is even bordering on a dangerous conclusion. To get again specifically and to do it in a way that is an opinion giver transformed into opinion seeker. Because there's a couple different ways we all show up in meetings. An opinion giver is one who makes declarations that is often, believe it or not, for a know-it-all seen as confrontation. An opinion seeker still gives opinion as a question. That's the beauty of it, where you can say, I want to ask you a question about point number 3. When you look at the statistical model on how you compare causation to correlation, wasn't it true that Hewitt-Laylock said that correlation does not imply causality? Okay, so All I did was I set the premise and I raised it as a question. Now, of course, that means that the person is going to take the floor again. So it does demand energy from you in this kind of communication. But again, remember, this isn't all about you being a know-it-all, because that would be condescending. You may know it some too. So treat this dialogue using Katie's paradigm with curiosity, but make sure that you are accurate in what you are saying. So easier said than done when you have forethought and foreknowledge about what is coming in a conversation with this person. But you've probably identified this person, especially if they're a colleague, as someone who is seeing themselves as subject matter expert in a specific arena. Just try to make sure that you're not bringing things up that are wrong, because that person will pounce. That person will make sure to explain to you why you're not at all correct on any level. But then try, if you can, to go on to another issue. Remember, one of the things for this person is they get to a point where they see confrontation as aggression. So you're being the grown-up in the room here, going on to another issue can be useful. And worst case, sometimes you just need to let the person be the expert on that issue and figure out another route if you get into a back and forth kind of dialogue with that person. Okay, so that is the know-it-all.
Thank you, Karen. We are coming up on the conclusion of our time relatively soon. Do you wish to speak a little bit about the final personality?
If you feel like it would be better just to suspend at this point, that's okay too, because the backstabber is a pretty evolved one.
Okay.
What do you think?
I think it would be beneficial to talk about it and then briefly touch on breakthroughs at the end.
Okay.
So let's go there.
I will power through it. Okay, so the backstabber is a tricky one because, first of all, you have to find out that you were backstabbed. So sometimes you don't know that it happens. But let's talk about what makes this person tick. Think of this often. Again, this can often be hierarchical because the backstabber doesn't feel they have power. And so sometimes that is a role perspective, somebody who is sometimes junior to you, but not always. It can be a colleague. It can also be somebody who's at a higher position of authority. A backstabber knows how others should act, has a very clear sense of a worldview. We call it their book of shoulds. They have a big one, a big fat book of shoulds. You should behave this way. You should do things this way. And this backstabber typically has an unrealistic view of what you should accomplish. So believe it or not, a backstabber is someone who feels you have more power often than you have, and is more in what psychology calls an external locus of control in their own worldview. They see the world as happening to them. They see it as somebody else's job to fix the problem. So it's very different compared to an internal locus of control, a high personal responsibility kind of view of the world. I control my world for the most part. I can solve things. That is an internal locus of control and not typically endemic to the backstabber who has that external locus of control. The interesting thing about the backstabber, though, is, and what makes this difficult is, the backstabber believes you cannot take criticism. So that is part of the rationale of the backstabber for why they can't directly talk to you with criticism to your face. They rationalize that's why they need to go behind your back. But not surprisingly, the backstabber is fundamentally has a fair amount of insecurity. And again, could be a lovely person, but often rationalizes that they need to talk about you to make sense of their world. And too often, we rationalize it by going to people we know will support our view of the world if we're the backstabber. We're really good at that. We're good at identifying, oh, Katie's my friend. Katie is the person I'm going to go talk to because I know Katie sees the person the same way I do. So now the backstabber is looking for affirmation. So the two extremes are you either blow your fuse or you pretend to not know what's going on. Neither of those things are useful. So let's look at what you can do to, first of all, think about your realistic goal. It does demand that you bring this person out of hiding. You can't get clever or think you're being cute by figuring out a way to backstab the person back or to be passive aggressive. Passive aggressive where you might make an insinuating comment, but not being direct enough at the outset. So assume, again, this is something where perhaps you manage your legal operations team and you're speaking with a member of the team about a mistake they made, and that person seems to take your feedback fine, but then you find out later the person went and dished about you, talked about you, complained about you, and you now need to handle that conversation. Partly because the backstabber is often prolific at backstabbing. In other words, they do it with regularity. So you know you need to get to that point. All right, so 6 steps. First step, make the honesty non-threatening. You don't want to be a steamroller with the backstabber. That will backfire. Ask the person first, before talking about the specific stab, about how things are going for them, especially in their interactions with you. In other words, you're setting the table. You're letting the person know, okay, this is not something where I'm about to be confronted. Because sometimes the backstabber knows why you're on the Zoom or in the office with them. They know they have been found out about the backstab, but not always. So start more broadly with letting this person have voice, because you are now teaching this person it's okay to raise unhappiness with you to your face. And that means being a great listener and thinking about where you can acknowledge there are things they are saying that are relevant and that would be useful for you to look at your own behavior. So to talk about that, to talk about solving uncovered problems. And now you're going to get them to talk about something called relationship interference. In other words, now you're narrowing more concretely to, are there ways? It could simply just be the question of, are there times when you feel like you cannot talk to me based on our working relationship? If you feel there is something I've said or done that makes things scratchy or uncomfortable for you, tell me about that. I want to get better at that. So obviously now you're getting to the point of the friction and what is impetus for them to have backstabbed in the first place. Hopefully that, again, opens the window to them feeling like you get it, you understand it, and that you can take criticism. Remember, they think you cannot. And at this point, you need to directly ask for a stop to the stab. So yes, it does mean being honest about the fact that you are aware that there's been criticism of your criticism, and that what you really want is a more healthy relationship moving forward. And then oftentimes this is critically important, not just to treat this as a one-off, especially if you are a supervisor to this person, but to figure out, how do you set regular communication with one of the spoken overt intents of talking about where things could be done better by you and by them or by others. So that's the key, is just to be alert to those types of things, and knowing for a backstabber, because it is such a common way that they have worked in the world, you need to give them a common meeting so that it's something that replaces the pattern or the routine.
Karen, that's so interesting. And I'm hearing the thread as well that Katie mentioned earlier about taking responsibility for what's yours. And so one of the steps here being that openness to own where you may have had a part in some relationship blocks.
Right.
And that has so much power.
Right.
I just want to appreciate, Karen, what I love about this is you've taken some of the most difficult personality types where it can be really hard to understand what they're feeling. And you would just be like, well, they don't have any internal life. They're just a jerk. They're just a
Right.
steamroller, and
Right.
it's like, no, actually, they are really stressed. They want things to go well, or they're just a backstabber. Like they're such a jerk, or they're just a know-it-all. And it's like, no, actually, like they're really intellectually curious and they want to connect through the sharing of facts. And like you've given us these like thoughts that we can think about these people whom it can be so hard to feel curious about, because we're just like,
Yes.
there's nothing to find. Or like, I love this backstabber point about like, they're feeling out of control in the world, and they're also convinced that you can't take it. Like this is just such good insight into the internal workings of these particular people that it can feel so hard to feel curious and empathetic about.
Exactly. And it's almost like something I've noticed over the years in movies. You know, the bad guy used to just be black hat decades ago. There was nothing redeeming whatsoever often about how Hollywood portrayed the bad guy in the Western.
Yeah.
And now if you think about it, a lot of psychological thrillers are showing some of these bad guys as having redeeming qualities within them as well. And so it's just getting more to the gray. It's getting out of the black and white view. You're wrong, I'm right. You're a jerk,
Yeah.
I'm not. You know, I'm a victim, you're the instigator. So that's why I really like this research.
Yeah.
Very practical as well. And I really appreciate both of you being part of this rich conversation. It's been very interesting. I've learned a lot. And as we think about closing out, which we'll be doing shortly, I wanted to invite each of you to share any breakthroughs that you've seen in your work in this area, or any final thoughts you'd like to leave with our audience.
I think I'm just wanting to name that it can be really small changes, I think, can make a really big difference. We don't need to be memorizing the frameworks. All the frameworks are beautiful, but even just really small shifts, like closing your laptop when you notice you're agitated, to like really analyze it like facts, or let your agitation come down, spending a second thinking about how they might be feeling, spending a second soothing yourself, all those can make a huge difference. We've shared so many ideas. It's an incredible buffet, but even if you just take one bite out of one of the things we've shared, I think it will make a really big difference. And I think I see that for my clients all the time. Just one good nugget of an idea can even shift all the pieces.
Katie, I totally agree with that, because when push comes to shove, sometimes you don't have your steps in front of you, or
Yeah.
your 2x2 in front of you, but it's continuing to think about it and making it front of mind. And it does make a difference, even making the effort, not getting it quite right the first time, but just seeing people with more grace. And I'll end with one quote that I love. It's attributed to Malachi Court. And he said, holding a grudge against someone is like drinking poison and expecting the other person to die. So it's about giving yourself grace too, and giving yourself a break, and not getting so stuck and ruminating throughout the day about something that we're all prone to do. But when you have some of these tools, hopefully it shortens the ruminating and gives you something positive that you can try on for size.
Thank you so much, Katie and Karen, both of you. This has been a really rich conversation. I
Thank you,
hope that
Helen.
Thank
Absolutely,
you.
my true pleasure. I'm grateful to have been in it with you. And I hope that the audience viewing this will enjoy this as well. And also like and comment on the recording, subscribe to ILTA YouTube and ILTA Voices. And we hope you have a great day.